Hey guys, I'm going to do a video on Bow Street runners and police. This is a really important topic. I can't stress how important it is to make sure that you are comfortable with the police force and you know a little bit about the Bow Street runners as well. The exam board love this topic. It pops up in just literally any type of question you can think of. So it's really important you know this. So just a little introduction for you. For the last 1,000 years of history, basically what we've been looking at is people policing themselves. So things like hue and cry, constables, tithings and things like that you had in the Anglo-Saxon and Norman period, really, they didn't really change a lot. Hue and cry was used right up until the 1700s. Yes, you've got people like night watchmen and you've got the role of the constable that's developed into a kind of a proper job, but essentially up until 1829 we don't have any kind of proper police force. So really in the period before, what we're looking at is people policing themselves, and this is a huge change. The idea of setting up a police force that's accountable to the government and is run by the government is a massive change for people. So that leads us nicely to our factors, and I've kept them quite short really because the three that I just think link to this perfectly are the attitudes of people. And you know, if you remember back to your Jack the Ripper lessons, you remember that people were not fond of the police at first. They didn't like them at all. They saw them as a kind of military threat and a threat to their freedom. Then you've got individuals, and obviously Robert Peel is absolutely fundamental here. For the Bow Street runners, we're also going to talk about the Fielding brothers, and as factors, they're absolutely unbelievably important, especially Robert Peel. And then we've got the role of the government, which is really interesting for this topic because when we're thinking about the role of the government with the police force, we've got to just remember that Robert Peel was part of the government, but also that the government were afraid of this rising crime that was seen to be a threat to society. So I'm going to start with the Bow Street runners, and then they do the police force. So Bow Street runners were around from 1749 to 1839. In 1748, a man called Henry Fielding and his brother John Fielding became the magistrates at Bow Street Magistrate Court. So in 1748, Henry and John Fielding become the magistrates of Bow Street magistrates. And in 1749, Henry decides that actually what he needs is some kind of early kind of police force, some kind of force of people that he can use to patrol the streets of London and look after the surrounding area. So he sets up the Bow Street runners. And what these really are essentially are a private police force of people that will go out and patrol and catch criminals, beat criminals up on the street and arrest them and investigate crimes. And the reason why the Bow Street runners is really important is because the things that Henry and John Fielding do now in the mid-1700s are going to have a big impact on the police force. So first of all, the Fieldings believed that rising crime was a result of a breakdown in society. And what they basically saw the problem was that the population was increasing, people were not behaving themselves and obeying the law, and also they saw corrupt politicians who were doing things they shouldn't do, and thought that actually what they needed was their own kind of police force to go out and deal with this. So they set up the Bow Street runners, who mainly patrolled London and investigated crimes. Overlap here with highwaymen, they set up the horse patrols to stop highwaymen, which works really well. It works so well, in fact, that in 1805 they actually set up a patrol of 54 men, which is quite a significant force considering before that they were mainly pairs or in small groups. So there's two huge successes for them, setting up the Bow Street runners to patrol and investigate crimes, and then setting up horse patrols to stop highwaymen. And finally, really important one, and links into your factor of communication, they published their own newspaper called the Hue and Cry. And what this did was it allowed them to tell people about certain types of crimes that were happening, give people information about criminals and about stolen goods and things like that. So it basically was the first attempt at some kind of crime network. They also got magistrates and jailers from all over England to pass them details about crimes, and they shared this information. This is really important because this is the first time that anyone's actually tried to create some kind of communication, some kind of newspaper about crimes. So that's why the Bow Street runners are really important. And when you're revising them, if you can remember that they set up the Bow Street runners, They set up the horse patrols and they published the hue and cry. There's 3 points there that could fit nicely into an explain question. So let's have a look at the Metropolitan Police Force. Now, as I told you before, these were set up in 1829 by Robert Peel. They replaced watchmen and constables, and very soon after being set up, they would actually absorb the Bow Street Runners as well. The first force had 3,200 men. Think back to your Jack the Ripper lessons that we did. Remember that the police were seen as a threat, and Robert Peel and the government knew this. So they deliberately designed their uniform to not look like a military uniform. So they wore blue, whereas the army were dressed in red. Initially, they didn't have a helmet, which that was brought in a little bit later in the 1850s and 60s. But the uniform was designed to look civilian. They were trying to not make the police look like a threat, which is mainly why they don't have a gun. And I think we're one of the only police forces in the world that still generally don't carry guns, which is something to be proud of. So Robert Peel is Home Secretary. And to put a plaster on because I spelled secretary wrong. Robert Peel, Home Secretary, used statistics to show that crime was increasing. And crime was increasing at this time. And basically he tried to argue that the police force wouldn't be a threat, it wouldn't impinge on people's freedoms. They needed to stop the increasing crime rate. And increasing crime has always been a problem. It's in the media now. If you turn on the news or read newspapers, crime's a problem, crime's increasing. In this period, in the 1800s, people were really afraid of violent crime. They were really afraid of, people trying to blow up the government and things like that, and serious violent crime on the streets like murder and vicious muggings. And they saw the police force as a way of stopping this and dealing with it. So also the government was really afraid of protest. Now the French Revolution, which happened in 1789. Basically saw the whole French government and aristocracy and rich upper class have their heads cut off by the French people, and France became a republic. And the king in England and the government in England were absolutely terrified that this could happen in England. Every time you have a gathering of people, the government get afraid because they're worried about protest. And there's a general distrust of the poor. They really don't trust them at all. And the police were seen as a way of dealing with this, a way of stopping any kind of revolution or revolt. An example of why the police were seen as being a possible tool to deal with this is the Peterloo massacre, which happened in Manchester on the 16th of August 1819. And what happened here is that a group of people, quite a large group of people, met on St. Peter's Field in Manchester to protest about not having a vote, about the unfairness of the voting system at the time. And the government completely overreacted and saw it as the start of a revolution. They sent in the army, they sent in mounted troops on horses, and there was a horrific massacre of people. The police were seen as a group that could deal with this. You can't send the army in to deal with protesters. The army do one thing: they kill, they fight. Whereas the police force was seen as a way of dealing with protests without it getting out of hand. This links in nicely as well to the end of public executions and fear of execution, which I'm going to do in another video about the bloody code. But there is a real distrust of large groups of poor people by the authorities. And finally, you've got population growth. So you've got the growing population of England causing a real problem. Constables, night watchmen, people essentially using the old system of hue and cry, arresting people themselves. It can't cope. There's too many people now living in towns and cities in England. And there's too many people crammed into these dark, dangerous streets. And think back to your knowledge on Jack the Ripper. England in the 1800s was not a very, very nice place to live, especially places like London. So crime was really out of control, and they wanted to deal with it. And that's the main reason for Robert Peel getting his police force. I'm just going to quickly talk about how policing developed after 1829. It's really quite straightforward. There's a few little dates here and little bits of information that you might want to pull into an answer. 1835, towns were given permission to set up their own police force. 1839, counties were allowed to set up police forces, and the Bow Street Runners merged with the Metropolitan Police. In 1842, you got your first detective force. In 1856, it becomes compulsory for every town to have a police force. So that means that they force every single town in England to set up a police force. And then in 1878, you've got the Criminal Investigation Department set up. That's the CID. And they would investigate serious criminals like Jack the Ripper and people like that. So hopefully that's a nice overview of the Bow Street Runners and the police force.